My parents have never actually told me this story, and I've only started to put the pieces together myself. Now, it all started when I saw my dad battling stage 4 non-Hodgkin's lymphoma on his hospital bed. He was in his late 60s, he's looking frail and pale, basically dying. He was having chemotherapy, yet he was still on his iPad and his phone taking customer orders and working as hard as I've ever known him. All I've known this whole life is this relentless hard work. And early on it made me resentful. It was always work, work, work. My parents were never at any of my parents' evening, they never made it to any of basketball games, and even to this very day, we've never had a family holiday together. And any time I wasn't at school was time spent in my dad's van, driving around the Midlands, selling prawns to restaurants and takeaways. And this wasn't even my dad's only job. He'd worked in a morgue, he worked in a Chinese takeaway, and never stopped. But we never went hungry. But what I never had was time with my parents, and I never understood why. Now, the thing about my dad's cancer diagnosis was that it happened in spring 2020, COVID. And the only good thing about the world going into shutdown was that it gave us family time to support him through his treatment, but also time to talk for the first time about anything other than business. Now, I knew my grandparents had fled a civil war from China in the 50s, and I'd been born in Vietnam in 1977. But the details of how or why we ended up in the UK was something they never talked about. Now, there were hints during these periods of reflection back in 2020, and having visited Vietnam on a work trip 4 years prior, I started to piece things together. So I asked my parents to go back with me because they're fluent in Vietnamese, they understood the culture, and given the scale of the order I was about to place, I knew their presence would smooth things over with the local suppliers. Now, Vietnamese business people have sometimes been known to con Westerners, and I didn't want to be in receipt of a container full of sawdust when I was expecting prawns. So we planned to be away for 2 weeks, but the deal had gone so smoothly, it was completed within the first week. So in that second week, my mum said to me, "Take me back to Saigon. It's now known as Ho Chi Minh City, and it's the place of my birth." Now, if you've been to the Far East, you know the streets are hustle and bustle. Almost like a tourist trap in every street. People selling everything. Like fake Rolexes, silly umbrella hats. And the demographic of people, everybody was selling something, regardless of your disability, your age. And that's because of a lack of welfare system. Everybody had to work. There was no money. If you had no money, it meant your next illness would probably be your last. Now, whilst I was walking down the street, I remember seeing this old lady, she was selling coffee for 10 cents a cup. And the only thing that was going through my head was, oh wow, 10 cents a cup, how many cups of coffee must you sell to sustain this store? How many cups of coffee must you sell to buy a plane ticket out of there? However, my mum would then see this lady, and she acted like a schoolgirl. I was like, oh my God! And I just remember her being happy and chatting and being a child for the first time. I've never known her to be social in any way. It was a best friend, her neighbour, her childhood neighbour, and my mum not seen her in 35 years. And the reason my mum recognised her was because where her coffee stall was opposite the apartment where I was born and I grew up. The lady took us to the apartment that we lived until I was 18 months old. And just seeing that, it was a really humbling experience. Just seeing the poverty in a whole block of flats, and from the images you'll see there's a guy having a shower just outside. Anyway, that night the lady took us to her favourite restaurant, and we were eating the most authentic, the most beautiful spicy beef noodles. For those of you who have seen the Robin Williams film, Good Morning Vietnam, you might have remembered seeing when he eats the noodles and it blows his head off because it's so spicy. It was delicious, but I just remember the spice, and also it was 38 degrees heat. So I was sweating, I was snotting, and there were no napkins on the table. I just wiped it all on my t-shirt sleeve. And I carried on eating. And a few minutes later, I get a tap on my shoulder and I get handed some pocket tissues for $1. I was getting, yeah. I bought them, but then I looked across and it was a 7-year-old child then selling the napkins to everyone on our table, but the next table and the next store. There's that moment where it's a realization, like, oh my God. My daughter at the time, she was only 4 years old. Would she be doing the same in a few years' time, supporting her family? After the meal, we went back to our hotel, and we went back on scooter taxis, and I just remember my mum on the back of her friend's scooter, riding along, me and my dad on the taxis, and my mum was just jibber-jabbering all night, just non-stop, jib, 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 jib. My mum had convinced her friend to come back with us to the hotel because they had a special contraption to which this coffee was made, and wanted her friend to look at it, see if she could incorporate it into her business. But then she dropped my mum off right at the door of the hotel. Then she turned the scooter around and started riding off. And my mum said, hey, you agreed to... And the lady just turned around to my mum and said, no, places like that are not for people like us. Now, the hotel, it wasn't the Ritz, it wasn't, a 6-star hotel, anything like that, but it was the Meridian. For me, that was a 4-star business hotel, and going into there for a cup of coffee, it's no different to going into Costa's or Starbucks for maybe a $4 or $5 coffee. Just got to remember, earlier that day, the lady was selling coffee for 10 cents a cup. So, whilst this trip 7 years ago was an eye-opener for me, it showed me what life could have been like had we stayed in Vietnam. I still didn't understand what caused my parents to give up everything they had, their friends, their family, their life there. Or how we even ended up in a council estate in Rung Khon in the early 80s. And my parents were still shut down any questions I had. So I started doing my own research, just by Googling Vietnam War. And anyone could do this. War North versus South, communists versus capitalists, China versus America. You saw not so long ago where Americans pulled their troops out of Afghanistan within 1 week. And from what I've read, they did exactly the same in Vietnam. But in less than a week, in 3 days, all Americans were pulled out of Vietnam and just left everybody who supported them to fend for themselves. Now, during that time, mid to late 70s, oppression was rife. Politician leaders, religious leaders, entrepreneurs disappearing overnight. And when I say disappear, they weren't locked up in a dark room somewhere. They were taken down to the firing range. There's a really famous image of a monk who set fire to himself in the busy street of Saigon. And it just highlighted the desperation ordinary people had for peace. I suppose it takes me back to my parents' story, my father's story, my granddad. He lost a leg by standing on a mine in the war. And he had 13 children. And his own little business. And if those of you who've been to the Far East, you might have seen a little scooter, carrying a load of stock on the back, overloaded, and just riding through the streets doing business. Well, that would be an image of my granddad. But he passed away when my dad was only 13 years old, leaving my dad with 12 siblings to feed and his mother. And so my dad's been working since that age. taken over my granddad's business, underwear distribution, but in reality it was a little scooter, a couple of sewing machines, and I've seen an image somewhere where I'm sat in a footwell, mum on the back, and my parents described one night, and the night they decided to leave anyway, riding through Saigon. Usually there are checkpoints with armed guards, and usually my dad would just ride through them, minding his own business. One night the guards put their hand up and halted him and wanted to check his paperwork. Now, my dad didn't have any paperwork with him because obviously he was working illegally as an entrepreneur and that wasn't allowed. And so he accelerated because he knew if he'd stopped, he would disappear. Mum on the back, me on the front, load of underwear. My dad accelerates through. And bang, bang. 2 shots. Now, they might have been misfiring or just warning shots. Obviously, we're alive today to tell the story. But it was enough for my parents to be so terrified, they sold absolutely everything they had for 3 tickets on a boat. And when I say boat, they weren't cruise liners with seats. In fact, they had no seats. They were just fishing boats. If you can imagine a boat about the size of 2 tennis courts, filled with 600 people. That's what it's like. It had no toilets, no facilities. And my mum once described that she would hold me for the whole duration of this trip. It was supposed to be a 5-day trip to Malaysia. In fact, I would have gone to any country to escape. But my mum would hold me on her lap for the whole duration, not letting me touch the ground, because obviously there were no toilets, people were just defecating and it was just disgusting on the floor. And it's probably where my mum gets some of her OCD from. So the boat broke down after just 2 days on the water. It wasn't designed to carry so many people. And at the end of the day, they were just fishing vessels and absolutely overloaded with 603 people on it. Mum once described it as completely silent. Nobody spoke to each other out of fear. They were just waiting, just floating. And the captain didn't view me as a child, as a human being at that point. It was survival of the fittest. And so he'd ration out oranges, 1 each to my mum and dad, and didn't give me 1. And so my parents would peel the orange, they'll eat the skin themselves and feed me the flesh just to keep me alive. But babies, children were dying and they would just be lowered into the sea. A few days on, I don't know exactly how long, it was over a week, a British cargo ship came to our rescue.
If you had not picked them up, how long would those boats have lasted?
The boats might have lasted a while, but the people would have died.
In how long do you reckon?
I reckon a lot of the children would have been dead in 48 hours. Some of them, when we brought them on board, were unconscious, completely exhausted.
I found this video only 2 years ago, and to hear that for the first time is like, wow. 48 hours and nobody would have been alive. Me being a child, even less than that probably. We were rescued by Saibonga, which is the name of the boat, by Captain Healy Martin, and I was just so fortunate to get to meet him early this year. Flew out to Northern Ireland, and unfortunately, it's very recent. He passed away only a few weeks ago, Christmas Eve, and I was at his funeral last week. But the risks he took to rescue 2 boats that day, he rescued 1,003 people, and to be such a humble man, doesn't see himself as a hero, it's almost something I need to do for him. Anyway, we were rescued by Saibonga and then taken to Hong Kong, which is a British colony back then. And we were taken to a refugee camp. My parents described a hostility towards the Vietnamese people, the Vietnamese boat people. They were burning effigies, there were placards stating, we don't want these refugees, immigrants that come in here to take our resources, similar to what you see at Calais. And again, it's history repeating itself. But we were eventually flown over to the UK. Now, the British government at the time looked at examples of certain communities in the UK and didn't want colonisation of the Vietnamese community. They wanted integration. And so they did a dispersal programme and scattered us throughout the whole UK. And me and my parents ended up in Runcorn. And back then it was the most deprived council estate in the UK. And I remember being the only Chinese person in my school. My dad spoke limited English. My mum didn't speak any English at all. And I remember having to translate from a young age, enrolling both me and my younger brothers at the age of 6. Now, recently I went back to Runcorn and I looked at the house I actually lived in until I was 13 years old. And it's amazing how you could block certain memories out. But up until the age of 13, I would be living in this 2-bed mid-terrace council house, and we shared a double mattress on the floor. And I've shared that bed with my nana and my 2 younger brothers at the time. Discovering my true heritage has made me appreciate my parents' sacrifice, but also helped me understand why they protected us from the truth for so long. A mixture of post-traumatic stress and the shame of being associated with being labelled a refugee. Now, fast forward a few years from Runcorn and I moved to the Midlands. Dad and I started Ocean King in '97 from a garage and a truck, and we started selling supplies to restaurants and takeaways in Leicestershire and the wider East Midlands. And as each brother left uni, they joined a company. And today, we're a successful family-owned business with a growing team. With my recent discoveries, that resentment I had for my parents' work ethics has actually turned into immense appreciation for the risk they took. It's also shaped the way I want to run my business going forward. And it's actually the motivation behind my mission statement. We're so grateful for the opportunities that this country has given us to enrich our lives. It's now a question of what we can do to enrich the lives of those in our community. What can we do to make you better by walking through the doors of Ocean King? We've come a long way from a truck in the garage in the last 28 years, and these are the doors we'll welcome you through. The journey from the garage to this point took us via an 18-year period in Loughborough, where we're bursting at the seams. We're spilling out onto the car park, and all we wanted was space. So we recently moved into our custom designed state-of-the-art premises here in Derby. And I've used lessons learned from our history to develop our culture. And the plan, or the dream, would be to have a facility that provided a cafe, Vietnamese coffee, roast-up dinners, have a wellbeing and business hub, professional services, language schools, breakout zones, yoga mats, Peloton machines. And this is just the start. We have an ambitious 10-year plan for growth and we hope to have 3 of these hubs in that period. And as for me, integration worked. I stopped being Hung Tuan Thai in the early 80s when my dad went to Depot to change our name to English ones. And new friends would think I'm a Stokey because they know I like a pint in a pub and a game of football, and they certainly don't see me as a refugee. I'm the CEO and founder of Ocean King and the proud manager of Ashby United Cavaliers under-9s football team. And I'm also a multi-award winning entrepreneur. For 7 years, I was also chair of finance on a board of governors for my local primary school. I'm a proud team member of the Young Enterprise Ambassadors Hub for the East Midlands. I never miss my kids' football matches or life events, and we go on family trips as often as we can. And this year, I received an honorary master's degree from the University of Derby. My name's Stephen Ty, aka the Prawn King, and I thank you for listening to my story.